Dr. Crix Villano adjusted his ceremonial healing crystals, and gazed out at his classroom with the kind of smug satisfaction that only comes from having 17 advanced degrees and absolutely zero sense of humor. The Galactic Medical Academy's chrome walls gleamed under artificial starlight, and holographic displays showed off the latest in quantum healing technology. This was, without question, the most prestigious medical institution in the known galaxy. And Crix? Well, Crix was basically the medical equivalent of a peacock who'd gone to Harvard. "Welcome, students, to advanced xenobiology and emergency medicine," he announced, his voice carrying that particular tone professors use when they want you to know they're smarter than you'll ever be. "Today we shall demonstrate the superiority of our evolved medical techniques over the primitive methods still used by lesser civilizations." His students sat in their bio-adaptive chairs, looking about as confident as a group of teenagers taking their driving test. There was Court, a crystalline being who looked like someone had crossed a chandelier with a calculator. Every surface of his body was covered in precise geometric patterns that shifted colors based on his emotional state. Right now they were a nervous shade of amber, which probably meant he was overthinking things again. "Professor Villano," Court chimed in, his voice sounding like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, "I have calculated the optimal angle for quantum resonance therapy to exactly 4 decimal places. Should I recalibrate for atmospheric density variations?" "Excellent attention to detail, Court," Crix replied, though his tone suggested he found the question about as exciting as watching paint dry in a vacuum. Next to Court sat Fizzle, a gaseous entity who was technically brilliant but had the unfortunate habit of literally losing his composure under pressure. He existed in a containment suit that looked like a cross between a space helmet and a lava lamp, his purple-green essence swirling anxiously inside. Professor," Fizzle's voice bubbled through his suit's speakers, "what if I accidentally disperse during the practical exam? Last time I got nervous, I ended up floating around the ceiling for 3 hours. Maintain your molecular cohesion, Fizzle. We cannot have you contaminating the sterile environment," Crix said, making a note on his holographic clipboard. The third student, Frank, was a multi-limbed creature who looked like an octopus had decided to become a philosopher. His 17 arms were constantly in motion, taking notes, scratching his head, and gesturing wildly as he processed information. Frank had the unusual ability to consider every possible outcome of any situation, which made him incredibly thorough and absolutely terrible at making quick decisions. "But Professor," Frank interjected, 4 of his arms waving simultaneously, "what if the patient responds better to treatment method B instead of method A? Or what if their biology is compatible with method C, but not method D? And what about the ethical implications of using method E when method F might be more culturally sensitive?" Crix's eye twitched. Teaching these students was like herding cats. Very anxious, over-analytical cats with too many appendages. "Students, please," he said, raising his hand for silence. "Today's lesson will demonstrate why our advanced techniques are superior to the crude methods still employed by primitive species. We will be using the latest in holographic patient simulation, quantum diagnostic equipment, and bioharmonic healing matrices." He gestured grandly at the medical bay around them, where machines hummed with the kind of technological sophistication that made smartphones look like stone tools. Floating screens displayed real-time biometric data, while robotic arms moved with surgical precision, calibrating instruments that probably cost more than most planets' annual budgets. "Our methods," Crix continued, "represent thousands of years of medical evolution. We have transcended the barbaric practices of physical intervention. No more crude tools, no more primitive manual techniques. We heal through harmony, through quantum resonance, through the elegant application of pure science." The students nodded eagerly, though Court was still calculating angles. Fizzle was trying not to evaporate, and Frank was considering 17 different ways the lesson could go wrong. What none of them knew was that their perfectly ordered, technologically superior world was about to be turned upside down by the arrival of someone who thought the best medical equipment was a pair of hands and a willingness to get his knuckles dirty. But that's a story for the next part of our tale. The pristine tranquility of the Galactic Medical Academy was shattered by the sound of someone whistling what could only be described as a tune that had no business existing in such a sophisticated environment. The melody was catchy, sure, but it had all the cultural refinement of a construction site at lunch break. Jake Martinez strolled through the Academy's gleaming corridors like he owned the place, which was particularly impressive considering he'd arrived exactly 37 minutes ago and had already managed to confuse 3 different navigation systems. He was built like someone who'd spent more time lifting patients than textbooks, with the kind of confident swagger that comes from knowing you can handle whatever life throws at you, even if life happens to throw it from 3-star systems away. "So this is the fancy alien medical school," he muttered to himself, looking around at the floating holographic displays and quantum-powered everything. Looks like someone took a hospital and ran it through a sci-fi movie filter. Dr. Crix spotted the newcomer and immediately felt his stress levels spike. The human was wearing what appeared to be a standard medical uniform, but it looked positively primitive compared to the sophisticated bioadaptive garments worn by proper medical professionals. Worse, he was chewing something that made small popping sounds. "You must be the exchange student from Earth," Crix said, his tone suggesting he'd rather be hosting a plague convention. "I am Dr. Crix Villano, head of advanced medical studies." "Jake Martinez, paramedic," Jake replied, extending his hand for a handshake. When Crix just stared at the offered appendage like it might bite him, Jake shrugged and dropped his hand. "So what's the deal here? I heard you guys have some pretty wild medical tech." "Wild?" Crix's voice pitched higher. "Our medical technology represents the pinnacle of galactic civilization. We have transcended the need for crude physical interventions." Jake blew a bubble with his gum and let it pop. "Uh-huh. So like if someone's heart stops, what do? Wave some crystals at them?" The three alien students exchanged horrified glances. Quartz crystalline surface flickered between shocked blue and indignant red. Fizzle's gaseous form contracted so quickly his containment suit made a wheezing sound. Frank's 17 arms all stopped moving at once, which was like watching a busy restaurant suddenly freeze mid-service. "We employ quantum cardiac resonance therapy," Crix explained with the patience of someone talking to a particularly slow child. "Our bioharmonic matrices can restore cardiac function without any barbaric physical contact." "Right," Jake said, nodding slowly. "And that works how often?" "Our success rate is 97.4%, Court chimed in proudly, his surface now glowing with confident green patterns. "Cool. Back home, we just punch their chest and breathe in their mouth. Works about the same, costs a lot less, and doesn't require a user manual thicker than a phone book." The silence that followed was the kind you usually hear right before someone calls security. Fizzle actually dispersed slightly from shock, his purple essence spreading thin before he managed to pull himself back together. "You punch patients?" Frank whispered, four of his arms covering what might have been his eyes. "Well yeah, if their heart's not beating, you gotta get it started somehow," Jake said, matter-of-factly. "Physics is physics whether you're on Earth or in some fancy space school." Dr. Crix looked like he'd just watched someone use a priceless antique as a doorstop. "Mr. Martinez, you are here to observe our superior methods and learn from our advanced techniques. I suggest you pay close attention as this may be your only opportunity to witness truly evolved medical practice." "Sure thing, Doc," Jake said, though his tone suggested he was about as convinced as someone being sold a bridge. "Can't wait to see how you guys handle a real emergency." The irony of those words would become apparent very soon. As if the universe had a sense of timing that would make a Broadway director jealous, the Academy's emergency simulation system chose that exact moment to activate. Red lights began flashing, and a voice that sounded like it had been designed by a committee of anxious robots announced, "Emergency medical simulation initiated. All students report to stations." "Ah, perfect timing, Doctor," Crix said, rubbing his hands together with the enthusiasm of someone about to prove a very important point. "Students, prepare to demonstrate the superiority of our methods to our primitive guest." The holographic projectors hummed to life, and suddenly there was a patient lying on the biomedical platform. This wasn't just any patient either. The simulation had conjured up Ambassador Glorp from the neutral zone, a bluish-purple alien who looked like someone had crossed a walrus with a businessman. He was wearing what appeared to be formal diplomatic robes, and his vital signs were flashing across multiple screens in colors that definitely weren't the good kind of colors. "Oh dear," Ambassador Glorp wheezed, his voice carrying the kind of panic that suggested this wasn't just a drill to him. "I seem to be experiencing severe cardiac distress. My chest feels like it's being squeezed by a neutron star." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Wow, your holograms are pretty chatty." "This is Ambassador Glorp, one of our most sophisticated patient simulations," Crix explained proudly. "He possesses full consciousness and can experience genuine distress, making him perfect for training purposes." "So you made a fake person who can actually suffer?" Jake asked. "That's not weird at all." Before Crix could defend the ethics of their teaching methods, the ambassador's vital signs took a dramatic nosedive. His heart rate flatlined, and every monitor in the room started beeping like a smoke detector convention. "Cardiac arrest," Frank announced, though he said it like he was commenting on the weather rather than calling an emergency. "Multiple organ systems failing. What's our treatment protocol?" This was the moment the alien students had trained for. This was their time to shine. This was going to be absolutely magnificent. Or at least, that was the plan. Cord immediately began calculating the optimal positioning for their quantum cardiac resonator, his crystalline surface shifting through complex mathematical patterns. calculating resonance frequency, accounting for atmospheric density, adjusting for patient's bioelectric field. Court, we need action, not arithmetic. Fizzle bubbled anxiously, his gaseous form swirling faster inside his containment suit. In his panic, he began to lose cohesion, spreading thin against the walls of his suit like purple fog. But I need precise measurements. Court protested, his colors shifting to stressed orange. If the resonance frequency is off by even 0.001%, we could cause harmonic cascade failure. Meanwhile, Frank was doing what Frank did best, considering every possible option and getting paralyzed by choice. Should we use the bioharmonic stabilizer, or maybe the cellular regeneration matrix? Wait, what about the quantum healing crystals? But those might interfere with the molecular reconstruction beam. Dr. Crix watched his students with growing horror as they descended into academic chaos. Students, focus. The patient is dying. Ambassador Glorp, meanwhile, was turning an alarming shade of blue-green. I say, this is most uncomfortable. Are you quite certain you know what you're doing? The quantum cardiac resonator finally activated, humming with enough power to light a small city. Court had calculated everything perfectly, down to the molecular level. The bioharmonic stabilizer was operating at peak efficiency. The cellular regeneration matrix was doing whatever cellular regeneration matrices do when they're working properly. And absolutely nothing was happening. Why isn't it working? Fizzle wailed, his form now so dispersed, he looked like someone had spilled grape juice in a zero-gravity chamber. Recalibrating. Court announced, his surface now flashing panicked red. Perhaps I need to account for quantum fluctuations in the local space-time continuum. Or maybe we should try the molecular reconstruction beam, Frank suggested, waving 8 arms at different pieces of equipment. Or the bioplasma infusion system. Or we could attempt harmonic cellular realignment. Dr. Crix was sweating now, which was particularly impressive since his species didn't technically have sweat glands. All their advanced technology, all their sophisticated training, all their superior methods, and Ambassador Glorp was still flatlining like a pancake. Jake, meanwhile, was leaning against the wall, watching the chaos unfold with the expression of someone observing a particularly elaborate train wreck. He popped another bubble with his gum. Guys, he said casually. Your patient's still dying. We are aware. Crix snapped. We are employing the most advanced medical techniques in the galaxy. Yeah, I can see that, Jake replied. How's that working out for you? The monitors continued their symphony of medical disaster as Ambassador Glorp's vital signs painted a picture that would make a horror movie director proud. The alien students ran around like headless chickens with multiple PhDs, operating equipment that could probably terraform a planet but couldn't restart one simple heart. That's when Jake decided he'd seen enough. Jake pushed himself off the wall with the casual confidence of someone who'd been through this exact scenario about 1,000 times. Just usually without the fancy light show and panicked aliens running around like they were trying to solve quantum physics with kitchen utensils. All right, that's enough, he announced, walking toward the medical platform while cracking his knuckles. The sound echoed through the high-tech medical bay like gunshots in a library. Mr. Martinez, step away from the patient, Dr. Crix commanded, his voice reaching octaves that probably violated several noise ordinances. You are not authorized to dock. With all due respect, your fancy gadgets aren't doing jack, Jake interrupted, rolling up his sleeves. Sometimes you gotta go old school. He approached Ambassador Glorp, who was now the color of a week-old bruise and about as responsive as a brick. The holographic diplomat's chest wasn't moving, his eyes were rolled back, and every monitor in the room was screaming electronic death threats. Hey there, Glorp, Jake said conversationally, as if he were greeting an old friend at a barbecue instead of addressing a dying alien dignitary. Rough day at the office, huh? Without any further ceremony, Jake placed his hands on Ambassador Glorp's chest and began compressions. Not gentle, theoretical compressions guided by quantum calculations and harmonic frequencies. Actual, honest to God, push hard enough to crack ribs chest compressions. The reaction from the alien medical team was immediate and apocalyptic. He's assaulting the patient, Court shrieked, his crystalline surface flashing colors that probably didn't have names in any civilized language. That's barbaric. Fizzle gasped, his gaseous form contracting in horror so quickly that his containment suit made a sound like a deflating balloon. Security, Dr. Crix bellowed, apparently deciding that watching a human perform CPR qualified as a medical emergency. Someone stop him before he kills the ambassador. Jake didn't even look up. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, repeat until they wake up or someone smarter shows up, he muttered, counting under his breath. 1, 2, 3, 4. You know, for a bunch of advanced medical professionals, you guys sure do panic easy. You cannot simply pummel a patient back to life. Crix protested, his voice climbing higher with each word. Medicine is a precise science. It requires delicate calibration of bioharmonic frequencies and quantum resonance therapy. Yeah, well, tell that to his heart, Jake replied, pausing his compressions to tilt Ambassador Glorp's head back and check his airway. Looks like your quantum whatever it is forgot to send the memo to his cardiac muscle. He leaned down and gave the ambassador 2 rescue breaths, a procedure so fundamentally simple and primitive that it probably predated written language. The alien students watched in fascinated horror, like they were witnessing someone perform surgery with a rusty spoon. This is madness. Frank wailed, all 17 of his arms flailing in distress. You're applying crude mechanical force to delicate biological systems. What about tissue damage? What about cellular trauma? What about the psychological impact of physical assault during medical treatment? What about the fact that dead people don't generally worry about their therapy bills? Jake shot back, resuming compressions with the same steady rhythm. 26, 27, 28. The monitors continued their electronic chorus of doom, but Jake noticed something the panicking aliens had missed. Ambassador Glorp's color was starting to improve, shifting from corpse blues to something closer to normal alien purple. The subtle signs were there if you knew what to look for. A slight twitch in the facial muscles, the faintest flutter of eyelids, the way his chest seemed to want to rise on its own. Come on, Glorp, Jake encouraged, pressing harder. Don't make me look bad in front of the space doctors. They already think humans are knuckle-dragging mouth breathers. We heard that, Crix muttered. Good, 'cause I wasn't whispering, Jake replied, not missing a beat in his compressions. 30, and breathe. He delivered 2 more rescue breaths, and this time Ambassador Glorp's chest rose and fell with something that looked suspiciously like independent respiratory function. The monitors, which had been playing their symphony of medical disaster, suddenly started showing signs of life. Heart rate climbing from 0 to something that wouldn't embarrass a marathon runner. Blood pressure readings that didn't look like they belonged in a morgue. Brain activity that suggested someone was actually home upstairs. Impossible, doctor, Crix whispered, staring at the monitors like they were showing him footage of unicorns dancing the tango. Yeah, well, impossible is kind of humanity's thing, Jake said, sitting back on his heels, but keeping his hands ready. We're real good at making stuff work when it's not supposed to. The alien students had gone completely silent, watching the monitors display vital signs that their multi-million credit equipment hadn't been able to restore. Court's surface had shifted to a confused shade of yellow-green, like a traffic light, having an identity crisis. Fizzle had managed to pull himself back together, his gaseous form now perfectly still inside his containment suit. Frank's 17 arms had frozen mid-gesture, as if his brain had blue-screened trying to process what he'd just witnessed. Ambassador Glorp's eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on Jake's face hovering above him. I say, he wheezed, his voice weak but undeniably alive, that was most extraordinary. What manner of advanced medical technique did you employ? Jake grinned and patted the ambassador's shoulder gently. Ancient human secret, buddy, we call it not giving up. The silence that followed was the kind you usually hear right before someone's entire worldview collapses and rebuilds itself from scratch. Ambassador Glorp slowly sat up on the medical platform, looking around the room with the bewildered expression of someone who'd just returned from a very unpleasant vacation to the afterlife. His color was returning to normal, which for a neutral zone diplomat meant a healthy shade of purple with just a hint of professional anxiety around the edges. Well, he said, adjusting his diplomatic robes with shaky hands. That was certainly an experience I shan't soon forget. One moment I was discussing trade negotiations, and the next I was having what I can only describe as a most unpleasant conversation with my cardiovascular system. Dr. Crix stood frozen, staring at the monitors that were now displaying perfectly normal vital signs. His mouth was opening and closing like a fish that had suddenly discovered it could breathe air but wasn't quite sure how it felt about the whole situation. This is impossible, he stammered, his voice carrying the tone of someone whose entire understanding of reality had just been drop-kicked into a parallel universe. Our quantum resonance therapy failed. The bioharmonic stabilizers registered no response. The cellular regeneration matrix couldn't establish a connection. How did primitive physical manipulation succeed where our advanced technology could not? Jake wiped his hands on his pants and shrugged with the casual indifference of someone who'd just fixed a leaky faucet instead of resurrecting the recently deceased. Doc, sometimes the answer isn't complicated. Heart stops, you get it started. Blood's not moving, you move it. Guy's not breathing, You breathe for him until he remembers how to do it himself. But the precision required. Court protested, his crystalline surface now cycling through confused colors like a disco ball having an identity crisis. The calculations, the harmonic frequencies, the quantum mechanical interactions between biological systems and therapeutic interventions. Yeah, about that, Jake said, pulling a piece of gum from his pocket and unwrapping it thoughtfully. You guys ever hear of the KISS principle? The three alien students exchanged glances. Fizzle's gaseous form swirled uncertainly. Is that some sort of advanced human medical acronym? Keep it simple, stupid, Jake explained, popping the gum into his mouth. Sometimes the fancy solution isn't the right solution. Sometimes you just need to push on the thing that's broken until it starts working again. Frank raised 4 of his 17 arms tentatively. But what about the 17 different potential complications of direct cardiac manipulation? What about tissue damage from mechanical compression? What about the psychological trauma of experiencing physical contact during medical treatment? Jake looked at Ambassador Glorp, who was now sitting upright and looking significantly more alive than he had 5 minutes ago. Hey Glorp, you feeling traumatized by me saving your life? The ambassador considered this question with the thoughtful deliberation of a career diplomat. I must confess, while the experience was certainly undignified, I find myself remarkably grateful to be conscious enough to feel undignified. The alternative seems considerably less appealing. There you go, Jake said, turning back to Frank. Patients happy, hearts beating, brains thinking. Mission accomplished. Dr. Crix was still staring at the monitors like they were displaying evidence of alien visitation, which was particularly ironic considering his current company. But our equipment is the most advanced in the galaxy. Our techniques represent thousands of years of medical evolution. Our methods are used in the finest medical facilities across 17 star systems. And yet, Jake pointed out with the patience of someone explaining gravity to a particularly dense rock, when push came to shove, literally, good old-fashioned CPR got the job done while your space-age gadgets sat there looking pretty. The revelation was dawning on the alien medical team like a sunrise made of uncomfortable truths. All their sophisticated technology, all their advanced training, all their superior evolutionary development, and they'd been completely stumped by a problem that any human paramedic could solve with their bare hands. I don't understand, Fizzle whispered, his gaseous form contracting into a tight, confused ball. We've transcended primitive physical medicine. We've evolved beyond crude mechanical interventions. How can the less advanced method be more effective? Jake blew a bubble and let it pop, the sound echoing through the high-tech medical bay like a punctuation mark on the end of their assumptions. Maybe that's your problem right there, purple cloud guy. You got so busy evolving past the basics that you forgot why the basics work in the first place. He walked over to Ambassador Glorp, and helped him swing his legs over the side of the medical platform. See, back on Earth we've got this saying, if it ain't broke don't fix it. Your hearts work pretty much the same way ours do. Blood goes in, blood goes out, muscle squeezes, system works. When the muscle stops squeezing, you squeeze it yourself until it remembers its job. But the elegance of non-invasive treatment, Dr. Crix protested weakly. The precision of quantum-guided therapy. Doc, I'm gonna let you in on a little secret, Jake said, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing profound wisdom. The universe doesn't care how elegant your solution is. Physics is physics whether you're on Earth or in some fancy space hospital. Force equals mass times acceleration. Pressure creates flow, and dead is dead regardless of how many fancy machines you point at it. Ambassador Glorp cleared his throat diplomatically. If I may interject, as someone who was recently dead and is now considerably less so, I find myself inclined to agree with the human's assessment. While I'm certain your quantum healing methods are quite sophisticated, I must note that they failed to prevent my rather alarming rendezvous with mortality. The alien students looked like they were experiencing the medical equivalent of finding out that Santa Claus was actually 3 raccoons in a trench coat. Their entire understanding of medicine had been built on the assumption that more complex automatically meant more effective. The idea that a simple direct approach could outperform their technological marvels was like discovering that their sports car had been losing races to a guy on a bicycle. So Court said slowly, his crystalline surface now a thoughtful shade of deep blue, "You're suggesting that our advanced medical technology is inferior to primitive manual techniques." "Not inferior," Jake corrected, though his tone suggested he was being generous. "Just overcomplicated. You built a machine to thread a needle when sometimes you just need steady hands and good eyesight." Dr. Crix sank into his chair, looking like a man who'd just discovered that his PhD in astrophysics was less useful than knowing how to change a tire. This challenges everything we've been taught about the evolution of medical practice. Maybe evolution isn't always about moving forward, Jake suggested, helping Ambassador Glorp to his feet. Maybe sometimes it's about remembering what worked in the first place and not screwing it up with unnecessary bells and whistles. The ambassador tested his balance and nodded approvingly. Quite right. In diplomacy we have a similar principle: the most effective negotiations are often the most straightforward ones. Perhaps medicine follows the same rule. Jake grinned and patted the ambassador on the back gently. See? The purple guy gets it. Sometimes the best technology is the one that doesn't need an instruction manual. The room fell silent again, as the implications of this revelation sank in. The galaxy's most advanced medical students had just been schooled in life-saving techniques by a human who'd learned his trade dealing with drunk college students and car accident victims. It was the kind of cosmic irony that would be funny if it weren't so completely devastating to their professional egos. 3 months later, Jake found himself standing in front of a lecture hall filled with some of the galaxy's brightest medical minds, all of whom were hanging on his every word, like he was dispensing the secrets of the universe. Which, in a way, he was. Just not the secrets they'd expected to learn when they'd signed up for advanced xenobiology. "All right, class," Jake said, addressing an audience that included crystalline beings, gaseous entities, tentacled creatures, and at least one thing that looked like a walking houseplant with a medical degree. "Today we're going to cover what I like to call hitting things until they work, a comprehensive guide to human medical intervention." The lecture hall buzzed with the kind of excited murmur usually reserved for the discovery of new physics. In the front row, Court's surface was glowing with eager anticipation, his geometric patterns shifting into what Jake had learned were the crystalline equivalent of taking notes. Fizzle had managed to maintain perfect cohesion for the entire semester, apparently motivated by the fear of missing something important. Frank had all 17 arms poised over different recording devices, though he'd finally learned to make decisions without considering every possible outcome first. Dr. Crix sat in the back corner, looking like a man who'd gone through the 5 stages of grief and was now camping out somewhere between acceptance and bitter resignation. The Galactic Medical Academy's decision to add primitive human techniques as a mandatory course had been about as popular with the traditional faculty as a food poisoning outbreak at a medical convention. "Now who can tell me the 3 basic principles of human cardiac resuscitation?" Jake asked, pointing to a student who looked like a cross between a seahorse and a filing cabinet. The student's external gills fluttered nervously. Push hard, push fast, and don't stop until they wake up or someone smarter arrives." "Excellent," Jake said, grinning. "See, that wasn't so hard. No quantum calculations required, no harmonic frequencies to calibrate, just good old-fashioned mechanical force applied with the confidence of someone who knows what they're doing." A student in the middle of the auditorium raised what might have been a hand. "But Professor Martinez, what about the precision requirements? Surely the exact pressure and timing must be calculated to avoid tissue damage." Jake chuckled and shook his head. "Look, I appreciate that you guys like your math, but sometimes precision is the enemy of action. You know what the most precise CPR in the galaxy is? The CPR that gets started immediately instead of the CPR that gets calculated for 5 minutes while the patient turns into furniture." The audience scribbled notes furiously. Jake had discovered that alien medical students were incredibly diligent note-takers, probably because they were still trying to wrap their highly evolved brains around the concept that effective medicine could be so elegantly simple. "Now," Jake continued, walking over to the holographic patient simulator they'd installed specifically for his classes, "let's talk about the psychology of emergency medicine. Who can tell me the most important mental state for a medical responder?" Fizzle's voice bubbled through his containment suit speakers. "Calm analytical detachment with appropriate consideration for all possible variables and outcomes." "Nope," Jake said, cheerfully. "Stubborn refusal to let the patient die on your watch, everything else is just details." Dr. Crix made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a groan. The human had been teaching for 3 months now, and his success rate was frankly embarrassing. Students who had struggled with advanced quantum healing techniques were suddenly excelling at basic life support. Emergency response times had improved by 400%. Patient survival rates had gone through the roof, which was particularly impressive in a space station. The most irritating part, from Crix's perspective, was that Jake was actually a good teacher. He explained things clearly, he was patient with questions, and he had an annoying habit of making complex medical situations seem perfectly manageable. The students loved him, which was almost as galling as the fact that his primitive methods actually worked. "Now, I want to address something I've been hearing in the faculty lounge," Jake said, his tone becoming more serious. "Some of your professors think that learning human techniques is somehow beneath you. They're worried that teaching you primitive medicine is going to set back galactic medical advancement by centuries. The students exchanged glances. This was clearly a topic that had been discussed in study groups and dormitory conversations across the academy. Here's the thing, Jake continued, leaning against the edge of his desk. There's nothing primitive about saving lives, there's nothing backwards about using the simplest effective method to solve a problem. And there's definitely nothing shameful about learning from someone who's been doing this stuff since before you had quantum healing crystals. He gestured to the advanced medical equipment that surrounded them, machines that could diagnose conditions at the molecular level and perform surgery with nanoscopic precision. All this fancy technology is great. Really, it is. But technology is just tools, and tools are only as good as the person using them. If you don't understand the basics, if you can't think on your feet when the fancy stuff fails, then you're not a doctor. You're just a very expensive technician. Frank raised several arms simultaneously. But Professor Martinez, how do we reconcile the apparent contradiction between advanced medical science and primitive intervention techniques? Jake smiled and walked over to the window that looked out over the academy's sprawling campus, where alien students from dozens of species were walking between buildings that represented the pinnacle of galactic educational achievement. Kid, there's no contradiction, he said. Good medicine is good medicine, whether you're doing it in a cave with fire and sharp rocks, or in a space station with quantum computers and healing crystals. The goal is always the same: keep people alive, fix what's broken, and send them home to their families. He turned back to the class, his expression more serious than they'd ever seen it. The real advanced technique isn't knowing how to operate the fanciest equipment, it's knowing when to use the simple solution, instead of the complicated one. It's having the confidence to trust your hands and your brain instead of always looking for a machine to do the thinking for you. Ambassador Glorp, who had become something of a celebrity around the academy after his dramatic resurrection, entered the lecture hall and took a seat in the front row. He'd taken to attending Jake's lectures whenever his diplomatic schedule allowed, claiming it was important for interspecies relations. Really, he just enjoyed watching the human challenge everyone's assumptions about medicine and technology. Ah, perfect timing, Jake said, noticing the ambassador's arrival. Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted carbon-based life forms, I'd like you to meet my favorite success story. Ambassador, would you mind telling the class about your experience with both traditional galactic medicine and primitive human techniques? Ambassador Glorp stood with the natural grace of a career diplomat, adjusting his formal robes before addressing the audience. Certainly, Professor Martinez. Students, I have had the unique experience of being treated by both methodologies during the same medical emergency. I can report that while the advanced galactic techniques were undoubtedly sophisticated and theoretically sound, they failed to prevent my unfortunate demise. The human approach, while admittedly lacking in elegance, succeeded in returning me to the land of the living with remarkable efficiency. He paused for effect, a skill honed through decades of diplomatic negotiations. I must also note that the human method required no calibration time, no technical consultation, and no equipment more sophisticated than a pair of competent hands. From a practical standpoint, this represents a significant advantage in emergency situations. The students nodded thoughtfully. Coming from someone who had actually experienced both approaches, the endorsement carried considerable weight. Dr. Crix finally stood up from his corner seat, looking like a man who had wrestled with his pride and lost. Mr. Martinez, he said formally, I owe you an apology. When you first arrived, I assumed that human medical techniques were primitive and ineffective. I was incorrect. The admission clearly cost him, but he continued. Your methods have improved our emergency response capabilities significantly. Our students are more confident, more decisive, and more effective in crisis situations. Perhaps there is wisdom in learning from those who have mastered the fundamentals before attempting to transcend them. Jake nodded respectfully. Thanks, Doc. And for what it's worth, your fancy equipment is pretty impressive when it's used right. Maybe the real advanced technique is knowing when to use the high-tech solution and when to go with the tried-and-true approach. He turned back to the class, grinning with the satisfaction of someone who had just watched a very stubborn puzzle piece finally click into place. Which brings us to today's final lesson: the universe has a sense of humor. The galaxy's most advanced medical academy just spent 3 months learning life-saving techniques from a guy whose most sophisticated diagnostic tool is asking patients to rate their pain on a scale of 1 to 10. The students laughed, a sound that represented dozens of different species' expressions of amusement. It was a beautiful cacophony of understanding. But here's the real joke. Jake continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing the punchline to a cosmic comedy. You didn't learn primitive medicine from me. You learned that sometimes the most advanced technique is the one that's simple enough to work when everything else fails. You learned that evolution isn't always about moving forward, sometimes it's about remembering what worked in the first place. As the class filed out, chattering excitedly about the day's lesson, Jake found himself alone with Ambassador Glorp and Dr. Crix. The three of them stood in comfortable silence, looking out at the academy campus where the galaxy's brightest medical minds were learning to save lives by literally punching people in the chest. You know, Ambassador Glorp said thoughtfully, there's something profoundly satisfying about the fact that the universe's most sophisticated medical students are now experts in applied percussive maintenance of cardiovascular systems. Jake laughed and blew a bubble with his gum. Yeah, well, sometimes the universe likes to remind us that we're not as smart as we think we are. Good thing it's got a sense of humor about it. Dr. Crix shook his head, but he was smiling now. I suppose there's a certain poetic justice in it. We spent so long trying to transcend our biological limitations that we forgot how to work with them. That's the thing about biology, Jake said, watching a group of alien students practicing CPR on training dummies in the courtyard below. It's been working for billions of years without an instruction manual. Sometimes the best thing you can do is get out of its way and give it a little help when it needs it. As they watched, one of the students successfully resuscitated their training dummy, and the others cheered with genuine enthusiasm. It was a sound that Jake had heard thousands of times before in emergency rooms and ambulances back on Earth, but somehow it sounded different here among the stars. It sounded like hope, like progress, like the universe's way of saying that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most profound. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Jake couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, humanity's greatest contribution to galactic civilization wouldn't be faster than light travel or quantum computers, or planet-sized space stations. Maybe it would be the radical idea that sometimes the best way to fix something complicated is to remember how to do it the simple way. After all, the universe had been running on simple principles for about 14 billion years now, and it seemed to be doing just fine.